are located on the 3rd floor. In the event of a fire or fire alarm, please exit through the door in the northeast corner of the room. Go down the stairs to the 2nd floor, exit through the main entrance by the reception desk, and gather in the courtyard outside that entrance. In the event of a medical or fire emergency, please call 911 and notify the security agent at the front desk. The nearest defibrillator is mounted on the steps leading from the reception desk down to Grand Avenue. Thank you, and come visit us at the zoo.
To at least every 6 years determine whether the UGB has adequate land for expected growth of housing and jobs. And we last made this determination in 2018, so we're scheduled to do so again in the next year, 2024. Metro Council has directed staff to proceed with an approved work program, and we have requested periodic updates. And today we have with us Millie Wilkinson, our Urban Development Investments Program Director, and her team to help us understand where we are in this process. Alana?
Good morning, counselors. All right. We are so excited to be here this morning. It has been a long time coming. We were going to be coming here in July, and we're really excited to be here now. And to get to start this work session off. So I'll start. I'm Malou Wilkinson. I'm the Equitable Development and Investment Program Director in the Planning, Development, and Research Department. I use she, her pronouns. And I have with me today Ted Reed, Laura Combs, and Erin Key. And this is really the team, you know, it's the team and most of the team that's working on the urban growth management work over the next, and it started in the spring, and we'll be working on it through the next year and a half. So if we could go to the next slide, please. We were last here in March, and where we went over the work plan. We got a thumbs up from you all to move forward, and we've been proceeding since then. And as you know, the last urban growth boundary decision was in 2018. We're on a 6-year cycle that is that's defined in state law to look at our region's growth. And more recently, the council approved our first land exchange earlier this year, where you brought land into the urban growth boundary that was well planned by Tigard and exchanged it with land in another part of the region that wasn't ready for urban development. And this really emphasized the importance that the council places on land readiness to support new homes and businesses in these newly brought in urban areas. Next slide, please. So the council, if the slide showed what we want it to, what you would see is a map of the region that shows the urban reserves. And that's interesting that it is totally blank. But in 2024, in December 2024, the council will decide if new land needs to be added into the urban growth boundary. And the lands that we have to look at are those that were previously identified as urban reserves. And we can all look at the map later. They're kind of in a grayish beige color. And if we can maybe bring back the slideshow and go to the next slide after the map. The staff right now is working to develop the Urban Growth Report, which is a decision support tool for you all to use. It includes information on demand, on the forecasted jobs and housing over the next 20 years, information on the land capacity, and that's really the ability of that land to meet that forecasted demand, and also local readiness in the urban reserves. Next slide, please. Oh, good, it's working again. So this slide shows our timeline to December 2024. And if you look at the kind of gold circled arrow there, that's where we are right now. And we don't want to go over everything on this slide, but what I want to emphasize is that we are right now undergoing the technical work and the stakeholder engagement that will lead to a summer release of the urban growth report in a draft form for you to use as we move into from the summer to the fall to a decision on if the region needs to expand the urban growth boundary or not. And so at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Erin to go and the team.
Thank you. So we can go to the next slide. Hi, everyone. I'm Erin Key, and I'm going to pick up on what we talked about last time we were here in March and dive into our draft engagement plan. I'm going to give you an overview about it, and then we'll pause to answer your questions and to have some discussion. We're really looking for guidance from the council about whether we're on track with this engagement plan and if you have some thoughts and ideas to make it better going forward. And then once I'm done with that and we've had a good discussion and we're ready to keep going forward, the second part of the presentation today will be about conditions of approval. You may remember that the Tiger decision, the land swap, included conditions of approval for that area being brought in, some direction on how we wanted them to think about the planning work ahead. And so we'll talk about what typical conditions have been in past decisions, what some of the categories of conditions you might think about. We're going to talk about it in a really broad way so that we can then pause, take your questions, and just have a little discussion about what you think you might want to have on the table as possible conditions of approval in general when we come into this next decision, so we can start thinking about what those are way in advance, long before you've even gotten a proposal. So that's the plan for today. Let's dive into the engagement plan overview by going to the next slide. Okay, so these are the different elements of our engagement plan. We have a stakeholder roundtable, which you may remember us talking about when we were here in March. We also talked a bit at that time about our jurisdictional outreach, and I'll go over where we've been and a little bit about what we've heard. We are also working on a youth cohort that has their first meeting this evening. So I'll tell you a bit about that, as well as our plans around general public communication, the way that our team has engaged with our own DEI department and CORE, as well as standing committees, in addition to CORE, MTAC, and MPAC, and how we're engaging with those groups. You have an engagement plan, the draft engagement plan in your packet, so you have a little bit more details. I'm going to go over these categories, and then we can stop to answer your questions. Next slide. So first, let me talk about the stakeholder roundtable. We're going to start with its purpose. It's all about producing more transparency in the development of that urban growth report. Malou talked about the urban growth report and what's included in it. It's a decision-making tool for you as council. But in the past, it's a very technical document, and so it's been produced by staff and reviewed by other staff around the region, but we haven't explained how we collect that data and how we pull it together with a more general population. And so that's the purpose of this stakeholder roundtable, is to bring in not just planners and not even just developers who work in these areas, but business people, economic development professionals, housing professionals, to talk about how we do this UGR and get their thoughts and ideas and work those into the UGR. So it'll be a little bit different this year, the UGR when it comes out. We likely will discover topics related to growth that are important to stakeholders that may or may not fit into the urban growth report itself or the urban growth management decision, since that's focused mostly on land supply. So we're very hopeful that it'll be maybe the start to a conversation about what some of the topics stakeholders are interested in for a regional vision, if we pursue that in the future. So we'll be keeping kind of what we hear and taking good notes all through the process. Staff's going to consider the group's feedback when preparing a recommendation for you when you're facing your UGB decision next year. So again, to review, the stakeholder roundtable will provide input to the development of the UGR, have their thoughts and ideas incorporated in that report, and then staff will consider their thoughts and ideas when making a recommendation to you. The next slide.
Madam Chair,
Yes.
quick question to clarify.
Sure.
Is the plan for the stakeholder group to hold public meetings?
Yes.
Its discussions will be open to the public?
Yes.
Okay, thanks.
Stakeholder Roundtable has approximately 23 members right now. Their membership was appointed by Marisa Madrigal, your COO. Their first meeting is a week from Friday. That first meeting will focus on introductions and understanding the work program and their role. Eventually, we'll get into topics specific to the UGR, including how we measure capacity within the growth boundary. So that will be an exciting topic that we're planning for the second meeting. Let's keep going to the next slide. So I'm going to go to our next topic, jurisdictional outreach. Staff from the Planning, Research, and Development Department have been meeting with cities. I actually started to try to add more of the cities' logos to this slide, and it started taking over the slide. So the pictures are pretty, but they're not all of the logos. In addition to those you see, we've been to Multnomah County, City of Portland, City of Sherwood, City of Tigard. So we're really getting out there. They've been very broad meetings where we really are just asking the planners what they're working on, what they're worried about, what they're excited about. We've touched specifically on conversations of urban growth with those cities that have urban reserves at their boundaries and talked about their plans. We've talked about the 2040 planning and development grants, which we're not here to talk about today, but just to get feedback from them about how they can further support their work. So there's been a lot of benefits of this one beyond UGB. We're building our relationships with them and have been explaining to them this process so that they can be involved as best as possible. As well as meeting with jurisdictions. Let's go to the next slide and I'll show you some of the interest groups that we've been meeting with. Again, I couldn't fit all of the logos here, but you can see that we've been out and about doing presentations, primarily explaining what the process for the urban growth boundary decision is with various groups. We're working with WEA on a forum next month, which will go into a little bit more detail about the process and start talking about some of the same topics we'll be at the stakeholder roundtable with, which is how we do our analysis, how we approach the development of the urban growth report. So our reach will hopefully go beyond those involved in the stakeholder roundtable because we're going to be pretty involved in some of these organizations and going out as much as possible. If you think of an organization that's not on this list, it's pretty West Side heavy, honestly. We are just taking all invitations, so I'm open to all your thoughts and ideas about who we should reach out to. Yeah.
This is the comprehensive, well, this isn't comprehensive, but.
No, but we've been mostly on the west side.
Every one of those organizations, as I see them and understand their role, is emphasizing the D part of LCDC and not the C part. I'd like to see conservation groups, environmental groups, neighborhood livability groups be included in the interest
Great.
groups.
Perfect, thank you.
They have at least as much a stake in this decision.
Yeah, well, we've been pretty reactive in responding to requests. So by being proactive and reaching out to some of those groups and offering to come, I hope that we can add those to the list next time we come back to see you.
I know that, is it Sam Diaz is on the stakeholder committee from
Correct.
Thousand Friends?
That's
The
right.
Thousand Friends has a fabulous youth outreach program around land use, and we should tap into it.
Great. Thank you. Good
How
ideas.
best do we
Thank you.
build the list with you? Not here. What do you want us to do?
Well, we are going to pause when I finish this presentation to talk a little bit. So you're welcome to give us ideas or you can email them to me.
Okay. Let's keep going.
Yeah. Or tell groups that we're coming and have them contact me. You can do that as well too. Anytime you're talking to folks in your worlds that are interested in urban growth, they're welcome. You can connect us together and I can then work directly with them to schedule something that works with them. Okay, so now on the next slide, I'm gonna pass it over to Laura Combs, who's gonna talk a little bit about our youth cohort.
Great, thanks, Erin. My name is Laura Combs. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm an associate regional planner, also working on the urban growth management decision. And one of my main responsibilities with this project will be helping to co-facilitate a youth cohort. We're working with the local nonprofit Next Up, And we'll be taking a youth cohort along with us on this journey to complete the urban growth report. And the main goal will be helping them to learn about this process, helping them to learn more about what Metro's role is in the region, and to also hear their feedback and thoughts about the work that we're doing. So next up is an organization that focuses on advocacy, youth leadership, and civic engagement to amplify young people's voices in Oregon. They're really experienced in facilitating youth-focused groups with collaborative and innovative approaches, and they've worked with Metro in the past through both the RTP, and they're also a recipient of the Capacity Building Grant Program. So we're really excited to continue working with them during this project. As Erin mentioned, our first meeting is actually tonight here at Metro, and we'll be meeting with a diverse group of 15 young people. This first meeting will be getting to know each other, getting to understand the different perspectives that each participant represents, and getting a better sense of where they work, where they live, how they just move about our region. So really looking forward to that and getting to know everyone a bit more tonight. So why the focus on youth in the urban growth management decision process? This is the first time that we'll be having a group like this involved, and ultimately we wanted to support more inclusive engagement in the growth management decision, and we recognize that youth is one of the groups that will be most impacted by our long-range planning decisions. We recognize there's been a history of gaps in qualitative components of growth management decisions, and we hope to incorporate more of their real lived experiences in the urban growth report. We plan to take this group also out on a field trip at some point during their time with us to see kind of the urban growth boundary decision in action. We haven't decided on the location yet, but it could be a past urban growth boundary decision area or to go visit a city that has a proposal in for this cycle. And ultimately, we are also looking for opportunities to engage with the Metro Council along the way. And we really hope that the participants by the end of this process feel empowered to provide their own public testimony. Next slide. So along with the youth cohort, we have some additional ways to reach the public, primarily through our project webpage. We'll be keeping this maintained and updated through the course of the project, and this will be the home for public meeting information, helpful resources, all of the documents that will be available for the public review, and just a variety of other educational information. And we expect the general public will be most interested in engaging when we release the draft urban growth report next year. This will have an open public comment period to review the document, and that will also include any city's expansion proposals. Next slide.
I'm going to pick it up again and take us to the finish line. One of the other topics is how our group has been working with the DEI and with CORE. We visited CORE earlier this year, and they expressed an interest in the UGB process and wanted to stay involved. So we'll respond when they have room on their meeting times and participate by going to additional CORE meetings along the way in advance of your decision next year. CORE provided at that meeting, not only did they share their interest, but they provided some thoughts and ideas that helped inform the youth cohort in our planning for that. And we continue to meet with staff from DEI to talk about how our engagement can be more inclusive and how we incorporate diversity kind of along the way and to help us address challenges that we face as we go along. So we are really happy that DEI staff are willing to work with us and provide that great coaching along the way. Last slide. Next to last slide, I guess. Just a reminder, I think you saw this one in March. This is kind of a summary that you can see the way the decision is made. You are the deciders. You get to decide about the urban growth boundary and if it will be expanded or not. You can see that CORE and MPAC, as you know, provide a direct feedback to you. CORE was not in existence or was very, very new at Council's previous UGB decision, so that's a new element of this cycle. MTAC provides advice to MPAC. MPAC will provide a recommendation to you. You can see where where Metro staff fits in with the COO recommendation for the UGB decision. That will go to MPAC It can be shared with CORE before Metro Council makes its decision. And then here are the new groups that we talked about, the stakeholder roundtable, the youth cohort. They're providing feedback to staff, as well as a group I didn't talk too much about, a land use technical advisory group. This is local staff from the jurisdictions who come and check all our numbers and our analysis of land capacity and available lands and zoning to make sure it aligns with their local knowledge. So that's another way that we work in local knowledge into our analysis. So those are some of the new things, and also just a reminder of how the decision is made. And I'm gonna, last slide, I'm gonna wrap it up right there. So that we can stop and have a little conversation about this. Remember, what we're looking for council is, are we on the right track with this engagement plan? And I am taking notes about your thoughts and ideas. I've already received some of them about who we need to reach out to for our interest group engagement, but we'd like to hear other thoughts and ideas too to help make sure we're doing the best engagement we can.
Thank you.
So I'll pause there. Thank you.
Colleagues. Councilor Wong.
Thank you, Deputy President Lewis, and thanks to the staff for all this great work on putting together the engagement plan and stopping by CORE and having all these conversations. I guess my question is just on the engagement process itself. Like, how are you sequencing kind of public engagement with like the technical analysis? Yeah, I think one thing that can be frustrating is you give input, and then the engineers or the experts are like, well, you can't actually do that. So I'm wondering how you're thinking about that, and also just like kind of what kinds of meaningful decision points and input are we able to get from kind of all these stakeholders? A lot of the decisions, I think, are based on technical analysis of land readiness and, more technical elements. So like when you're engaging like a young person, like what are the types of questions and input are you seeking from them, and how are you making sure that's like valued when, there's all these other kind of like processes happening simultaneously?
Yes, there's a lot in there. At the heart of it, this decision is very technical in its nature, and it has been challenging to do for engagement for as long as we've been doing it, right, Ted? Yes. And so we've had a lot of discussions about, well, how do we face the fact that this is a really technical process? We are told by the state in many ways about how we will collect information and what information we bring to you and what your decision has to be based on. We bring you additional information and to give the council room to talk about other things like readiness, as well as just capacity and demand for land. But it is very technical. And so it does make it hard, because when we engage the public to talk about growth, it's not limited to supply and demand. They want to talk about affordability of housing and gentrification and really important issues that are related, but not maybe affecting that technical analysis or that decision. So we in particular thought about the youth cohort as an opportunity to help to engage youth in a way that we couldn't do if we were only on Instagram, or we were only touching people for one meeting or maybe for 5 seconds. What is the attention span these days? I don't remember, but it's short. With the youth cohort, we get to meet with a group over and over and over, engage with them on what's important to them, and connect that to the UGB decision and explain it and get them involved in the technical analysis, because we have enough time to like explain that and work with them. That's why we decided to do a youth cohort and thought that was a really good approach, because it would be hard to have just one meeting or one engagement and get really good feedback in return. So our hope is that not only we're building the education and knowledge of this group and getting them excited about land use issues in the region, but that we're preparing them to be really thoughtful in their ability to participate in the process and testify before council at the end of this and give you good thoughts and ideas about as private citizens about what they think you should do. And we can only do that because we're meeting with them regularly and building their knowledge base and building relationships with them and understanding what's important to them. So it takes that investment of time. We have learned in past UGB decisions that in general, we get the most response from the general public when we have an actual proposal, a city with a proposed area, and now we're talking about geography that people can hone in on, and now we can talk about the specifics of that area and what it needs going forward in the future, and all of that's helpful because where it's going to connect to conditions of approval is that once that area is brought into the growth boundary, that city is going to do additional planning work. So if we think they need to think more about a natural area that's nearby, or we want them to think about middle housing, the council has the ability to make those conditions of approval, for instance. So I have gotten lost because I've been talking too long, but I hope that gets at your question a little bit.
And what about like absent like concrete specific proposals, like would one of the deliverables or products of working with like a youth cohort be like a statement of like values? Like I think that could be helpful for us if the youth are really like.
That's a really good idea.
We want to maximize, conservation and protecting, resources for future generations, or I don't know, but
I think that's a really
I don't
great idea.
understand fully yet, I guess, what the final, it's great to build capacity and expertise among.
Well, my hope is that they'll come to you, or some of them may choose, if they want to, as private citizens, to come and testify before council and tell you their opinion about whether they think the boundary should be expanded and what they think of the proposed city expansion, because they will have learned enough about it going into that. But I like where you're going with, it could actually help them get to that place if we talk with them about what their values are when it comes to growth and what they think is important when we're talking about a potential expansion of the growth boundary, what needs to be balanced. Or maybe they're gonna, whatever those values are gonna help shape. So I think that's a really great addition to the process, so thank you.
I want to speak for my colleagues, but I think that would be really helpful for me, is to understand kind of like where the values and approach would be absent like specific, like we're gonna add these acres or not. Thank you.
Thanks, yeah.
I think if I can just add, Councillor Wong, I think you asked about the sequence of the engagement and the technical work. And if you think back to that slide, we're really bringing in, rather than waiting until we have a draft urban growth report that Marisa is ready to release next summer, we are bringing in this youth cohort and the stakeholder roundtable, and Erin and her team are going out and talking to whoever wants them to come and talk throughout the process of us developing the technical work, so that can be informing the technical work as we go along, rather than waiting to just hear next summer. So I just wanted to address that part of your question as well.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Milou.
Councilor Rosenthal.
Thank you, Chair Lewis. I have one comment and then two questions. First of all, the comment, I think, basing on Councilor Huang's comments, the youth cohort is an interesting idea. It's a challenge that I think you'll find very fascinating. Getting youth to come to a sort of a common understanding of the importance and values of land use planning and how we go about it, since I've been doing this for 40 years, and even among peers in the process, there is no common understanding. So coming up with that for the youth cohort is going to be challenging, and I think it'll be a very good learning experience for everybody. My two questions, however, are, one is regarding the stakeholder roundtable. How are we going to deal with, and this maybe can be handled offline, how are we going to deal with the regionality? Each of the regions of the area has somewhat different concerns, different potentials, different interests. Each of the cities has a different personality. And so is it possible for one stakeholder roundtable to represent some of these regional differences? That's one question. And then a more technical question would be, I'm assuming we have, and I haven't seen it, an inventory of open lands suitably zoned in each, whether it's metro jurisdiction or city jurisdiction available. I was just driving through parts of East County the other day and noticed there's big open fields that could be developed. I don't know what their zoning is. So I assume we have an inventory, this kind of inventory that it feeds into the process because it tells us how much available land we now have. I've seen the numbers that we have like 15,000 acres undeveloped, but I haven't seen it broken down, so I'm wondering if that's available.
I can help with both of those questions here in the meeting. The roundtable does not need to come to consensus. We're not looking for that group of people to come to one agreement. Instead, that's why we called it a roundtable, was that the purpose was for them to hear one another and for us to hear all of their individual ideas. They may be contradictory. They will be unique to their part of the region and where their experience is. I will point out that we've done a lot of recruitment to get regional perspectives on that group. So the area realtors, for instance, serve the whole region. So, but you're right, they're gonna come with different perspectives. They've got different work experience, different professions, different lived experience. So we're not expecting some kind of consensus or agreement, nor are we looking for one message. So if we get different things from different parts of the region, that's what we're gonna get, and we're gonna use that the best we can. In terms of the inventory, Ted can respond too, but I'll quickly just say that that's part of the urban growth report. That is part of the technical analysis we're collecting now, is an inventory of vacant land inside the urban growth boundary, together with its size, its zoning, and all of that is used to determine the capacity. That's that capacity portion of that circle you saw that Malou shared about the UGR. One part of that is the capacity. So we don't have it right now for you, but we will. Did I say that okay?
I would just add that part of that inventory is also lands that may redevelop or see infill over the next 20 years. So intensification of uses in our existing downtowns and main streets is part of the plan and part of the expectation under state law that we inventory those lands as well.
Oh, and to bring it back to the stakeholder roundtable, we'll be explaining that process, the steps we take to do that inventory to them at their October meeting. And we'll be taking that same information to MPAC and MTAC to explain our process and how we do that inventory.
And just a quick follow-up, if I might. Some land use laws changed recently, particularly allowing greater infill, getting rid of single-family zoning prohibitions and so forth. But that's sort of a work in progress. To what extent, or when will we have a sort of a good trend line as to how that is changing the nature of neighborhoods?
Yeah, the trend line is probably a number of years out, but as you noted, we do have some changes to law that we need to contemplate in this inventory work. The allowance of middle housing in existing neighborhoods is a big piece of that you mentioned. So we will collect data to the extent we can on the historic trend, but part of this is going to be an analysis of what's possible in the future and using the best information we have at this point, absent that long track record, since this is a pretty recent change in the law.
As an example, we've engaged Eco Northwest and Johnson Economics, and Eco Northwest is helping us approach this, the topic of middle housing and what effect that may have on the redevelopment potential of land inside the growth boundary, because certainly that's different today than it was in 2018.
Councilor Nolan.
Thank you.
Thanks, Madam President. Couple things, but let's start by following up on the line of discussion around land inventory. I would encourage you and the COO, since the stakeholder group reports to you, to require an inventory of participants of the land they own and intend to develop and where it is with respect to the urban growth boundary, the urban reserves boundary. Not to exclude people, but to understand the place from which they bring their advice. Someone who is developing middle housing and intends to do that on land within the urban growth boundary would perhaps bring a different perspective on where the urban growth boundary should be than someone who owns land outside of the urban growth boundary and wants the economic benefit of bringing it into the urban growth boundary. Secondly, your engagement process has many elements that reflect the original process done statewide when Senate Bill 100 was passed 50 years ago this year, folks. And I applaud that. But because it is 50 years, I think not just the youth will benefit from history lessons and current evaluations of the benefits to economic development and livability and the low cost of infrastructure and preservation of habitat and all of the 20 some odd goals at the state level. But everyone who participates, and it's difficult to cram that understanding of, as Bob Stacy used to say, under land use planning, we all give up a little in order for the community to have the benefits of this. Somehow incorporating the history and the benefits that have come about because Oregon took this step 50 years ago and we didn't go the way some other states that just sprawled out, hopscotching across the landscape. So it's a big task I'm putting in your laps, but finding some sense of communicating that, not just, I mean, first of all, starting with people who come present perspectives, but in advance of when we lay out the COO's recommendation, somehow thinking about how we prepare the general public for reacting to that, to try to keep their eyes on the regional benefit and not just what's happening on the block across the street from them. I don't have a specific, I can't give you a playbook on how to do that, but I think it's really important for people who weren't born or didn't live in Oregon when Senate Bill 100 started having its impact, to give them the benefit of that as a context for thinking about this. And finally, on a little bit more, I mean, you mentioned that it is a technical process, but the technical aspects of parcels and acres and areas in and out of the urban growth boundary really has to fit into our collective vision of how we want to grow. And I want to make sure we are not just hanging on the technical nature of the actual decision that the council will make, and finding a way for this to be an opportunity for people to really get to value statements, young people as well as, you know, middle-aged folks, disabled folks, communities of color. We have to train our ears to listen to their visionary and aspirational ideas and translate it into the technical stuff.
It's a big task that you're giving us, Counselor Nolan, but I
You're
hear
up
what
to
you're
it.
saying.
I'm confident you are.
I really appreciate that because I do think it is a technical process, but we can bring, it's an opportunity to bring more understanding across the region as to why we actually go through this technical process. And we have been taking the approach, we've been focused more on the tactical of the youth cohort and the stakeholder roundtable and going out to talk to people, but we haven't, I think what I'm hearing from you is really good advice in being sure that we're framing every time we talk about this, the reasons why and the benefits that we get from it. So thank you.
Councilor Gonzalez.
Thanks, Deputy President Lewis. All right, I have a few points. I'll try and be brief, but in terms of the process, I really admire the intentional effort from the get-go to grow the table and to educate and to bring people, up to speed, give them the opportunity to. I think that sometimes, we kind of create these technical layers of things that we say, oh, it can be too technical for someone to understand. What I've learned in my work is that most of the time, if you give people the opportunity to learn, they'll rise to the occasion and give you really excellent feedback. And so I know that there's a whole lot of technical layers and models and analysis and 50 years of legal work and changes and things like that we need to adhere to. But I think like I said, generally when you give people the opportunity to rise to the occasion, they do. So I'm really happy to see the process incorporate some of those elements in a few different ways. And I like the I guess you could say like the process flow chart that showed where we're going to have some of those changes. One of the things that I would really love to see come out of this process and with the recommendations that ultimately come to the council are some actionable policy items that are different, that incorporate opportunities for us to weave in our racial justice lens that we have. Specifically, when bringing in new plots, new areas into the UGB, looking at first-time homebuyer programs, looking at just different partnerships that we can make with community groups, community organizations, et cetera, to create pathways, and also different goals that we can set around affordability, like deep, real affordability for first-time home buyers that otherwise would not have the opportunity to buy new construction. I think that the market can support and sustain that, and I would love to see those kind of questions posed throughout the process, and for us to get some real feedback on that. The third item is kind of around the existing inventory of land that we have and recommendations that we can receive both from the process and from our staff as to how we can just continue to unlock our development opportunities. Whether that's NIMBYism, you name it, right? There's a whole bunch of different things we could talk about. I do want to also, as someone that lives on the west side and where a lot of the recent growth has happened, occasionally visiting some of those new neighborhoods. It's really impressive how much density we are building on the edge. Like literally, you're on the thoroughfare, farmland to the right, incredible density. There's parts on the end that are more dense than a lot of the neighborhoods in Portland that I visit. So I think like really dispelling the what we mean when we're talking about expansion on the edges and the kind of neighborhoods and the kind of development, obviously with a different flavor because it's on the edge of the region, different transportation modes and all that. But I think giving people the opportunity to not only learn about the history of the work, but how we've, as Metro and as a region, also learned how to do it kind of okay and do it well with recognizing there's a lot of opportunities for improvement. So I'm really excited for this process. I'm really looking forward to it. I like the process. I want to see some really cool things that we can do, and not just Metro, but really, having the private sector, community sector, government come together to create some real tangible goals and outcomes from a potential expansion process and things like that. So again, thank you, and just wanted to share some ideas with you.
Thanks.
Counselor Simpson?
Thank you, Deputy Council President. Thank you, Malou and staff. I really appreciated hearing all of this. I think this is my first time going through one of these processes, so it's good to hear it all. I had a couple of things. One, around the Land Use Technical Advisory Group. Are there any conservation groups that are on that body? Or would you be open or willing to allow them in that space so that they can be a part of the technical analysis? Because I think to Councilor Gonzalez's point, to put the information in front of folks, give them opportunity to understand it and then make a decision. Next, I got a nice little list for y'all for East County.
Good. Great. We got to catch up.
Yes, I got it right here. So we'll talk offline. And then we approved the land swap this year between Tigard and unincorporated Clackamas County. Is there ongoing engagement with those unincorporated areas about this process and possible impacts of, being a part of it or not being a part of it, so that they're aware?
Those are great questions, Counselor Simpson, and I'm going to ask Ted or Aaron to talk about a couple of them. But in terms of engagement with the areas in urban reserves that are not inside the urban growth boundary by definition, the current engagement needs to come from the cities because the council's policy is to only bring in land that a city has done a concept plan for. And so we are, the process, and I kind of didn't focus in on that when that slide was up, but we are, the deadline for a letter of interest from a city for a potential UGB request is in December, and then we would work with whichever cities submit a letter of interest or intent, I don't know what it's called, between December and April, when they'd be submitting their actual request, for that to be reviewed by all of the groups that we're talking about, by MTAC, by MPAC, by the stakeholder roundtable, the youth cohort, the Metro Council. Everyone would have that opportunity. But that engagement with those property owners in the urban reserves is really reserved for the cities who are looking to expand.
Or a county planning organization, right? Because they don't have a city.
Right now, we don't really have counties who are requesting to bring land into the urban growth boundary themselves. It would be a city who would be annexing it. We do have unincorporated urban areas in all of our counties in the region, but the approach has been that cities are providing urban services and not counties. So that gets at, I don't know if that is a satisfactory answer for you, but that's the answer that I have for the involvement of the property owners in the urban reserves right now. Ted, do you want to talk about LUTAG and
Sure.
Who's on that?
Sure. Councilor Simpson, we would welcome pretty much anyone on LUTAG, though its focus is very much around technical questions about how we count buildable land and how much capacity to count on that land. So the folks that we do have represented heavily skew towards city staff, county staff, a few development professionals, but really a lot of the people on that group are city and county staff that understand their local land inventory, understand the application of their zoning code and what it means for development potential. But we would welcome anyone who wants to attend those meetings. So if you have suggestions, we can.
I got a list for that too.
All right.
And I do think we do have some of those interests included on the stakeholder roundtable, which is at a different, it's not quite as technical, but they will have an opportunity to talk about our land use, our buildable land inventory. So there are different levels of engagement and desire to be at that very technical level. Did we get at all of your questions, Counselor?
Yes, ma'am, you sure did.
Okay.
Thank you.
Wonderful, thank you. So I have my own list. I'll figure out how to get it to you.
Great, thank you.
Engagement on the west side kind of opens the door, but in the south part of the region, we've got different groups. And then want to reflect that I agree with Councilor Gonzalez that we've done a nice job as a region about growing density at the edges. And Pleasant Valley is another example of that due to the good work of Happy Valley and Gresham working together on that planning process. I'm excited about the effort being put into bringing youth voice to the conversation. I think Next Up is a good partner. I also would ask that we contemplate how to engage cities who work with youth. Youth advisory boards at least a half dozen of our cities are extremely active and might be interested in weighing in. And I know a one-off is way harder, but for folks who are already deeply engaged in city planning and already advise local municipalities on land use decisions, there's not as much education on what a plan and a code is. I'm happy to make introductions. Youth advisory boards in my communities include Oregon City, Lake Oswego, and Happy Valley, and I believe Milwaukee as well, and I know other cities have them. I guess when I think through places to establish values and perhaps a fresh take on how we examine our growth as a region, I'd like us to think about a metric or analysis that incorporates brownfields and vacancy, because we cannot continue to chip away at the edge while we have enormous potential at brownfields located on already existing services. Some of them need significant investment. I know of one potential developer of a brownfield who's not able to do a finance stack without about $20 million of subsidy. And that seems like an enormous amount of money until you think about the fact that it's decades in the making of us dumping garbage into a giant heap that now we need to do something as a public to make right so that it can be built upon. And $20 million is a drop in the bucket compared to putting water, sewer, electrical, et cetera, to a new community not already served, forget transit. So brownfield / vacancy would be my kind of added twist. And then finally, I have heard that you have the desire to have private citizens, I would say individual residents, weigh in. And I would hope that at some point in this engagement process, you can come up with a goal, because we often at Metro host hearings where we have a long script. We have a hearing, nobody comes. If somebody comes, they are paid to be here because they are on behalf of an organization. And I'm just curious, how many real people do we actually want to hear from, and how do we get there? And then finally, my second question would be tribal engagement. What's your plan?
Okay. I'm trying to remember the first question.
The first question is how you plan to have a metric for how many real people come talk to us about this.
Oh, great, thank you. Well, as you were saying that, I definitely was thinking, oh, what a great goal for us to set for ourselves is as many real people as possible participating in the hearing for council. So I guess off the top of my head, 15 seems like a really great goal. If we can kill that one, we can do even better than that. So just off the top of my head of what would be a good amount of real people, but I think we can do even better. So I think that's a great goal for us to work towards. I like that one. Your second question is about tribal engagement, and I don't have a good answer. I have had some conversation with CritFic about what we're doing and why we do it, but that's the only initial conversation that we've had. We don't have required tribal outreach for this process, do we, Ted?
Not required, no.
So I'm open to thoughts and ideas about how to engage and who to engage in that.
I will also say we had yesterday, the ultra high-speed rail group met here, and in the morning, and that is looking at rail from British Columbia to Oregon. And we had a workshop, though, in the morning, and that included planners from British Columbia, and they asked a very similar question to you, Councilor Lewis, in terms of how we are engaging with our Indigenous peoples in all of our planning processes. And I think that they take it, they have a different approach in British Columbia, And so I think we can talk with our tribal engagement coordinator here and see if our tribes would be interested in being engaged on this process. And I think that's a concrete first step that we could take, Councilor Lewis.
Great, thank you. I think it's worth contemplating
Yeah.
how to work with our team to develop a plan. Because as soon as you're talking about a specific plot of land, as soon as you're talking specifics and a shovel's going in the ground, we're gonna have an opportunity to talk to them. Why not? I mean, everything we hear is talk to us sooner, not later. So in the meta planning process, I'd like to have an opportunity to have a concrete plan.
Thank you.
I'm looking at Andy, who's like, one more thing for Katie to do, but she's excellent and she'll give everybody good guidance. Councilor Rosenthal.
Thank you, Vice Chair Lewis. Just some comments that Councilor Gonzalez made prompted me to make one other comment, and that this UGB update issue is not only it's a challenge, but I think we need to be seen as Metro not only as the guardians of the boundary, just protecting the boundaries in some sense, or enforcing them, but I think the idea is that we also have to recognize that it's not just land available for housing, but it's the kind of housing. And we realize that we have middle housing and we have infill housing, but I think there's also more, that maybe it's time to stretch our minds and think of more that we can do to help the cities to come up with creative ways to make housing not only developable, but also to remain affordable as we move forward. And I think there are ways to do this. Such as covenants and things like that. I had some ideas from a local landowner recently at a get-together. So I just think that we have to pay attention not only to the housing and the development, but also to the affordability of the housing that exists inside. And it may require a certain creativity on our part, but I think we have to pay attention to it. And I think Councilor Gonzalez is right in saying we have to pay attention to these social issues as well, not just the boundaries.
Thank you. Do you all have what you need?
So we did have the way we planned this presentation was to go through the first part and have a discussion that's taken a lot longer. I'm wondering if it would be okay if we just take 5 minutes to go over the conditions of approval. And then we're not asking for council to have a lot of discussion about the conditions of approval, more that you have it in your minds as we begin this process.
Okay.
Is that okay?
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Deputy President Lewis. As Malou mentioned, we just wanted to have an initial discussion with council about these conditions of approval. You'll recall from your experience in the Tigard River Terrace 2.0 urban growth boundary exchange that part of that ordinance that you all passed had an exhibit that contained these conditions of approval. Those are required under our Metro Code. There are a couple of basic things that the council has to do in those conditions. And then there are other opportunities for establishing your policy objectives, much as Councilor Gonzalez was beginning to describe. And so we wanted to have that initial discussion, both so that you all can begin thinking about what your policy objectives are, but also to begin that discussion that needs to happen with any cities that may propose expansions. And I'll just note that this is only required if the council finds that there's a regional need to expand the urban growth boundary. And that is an open question at this point. So we'll be doing the analysis to answer that question, but we wanted to prep this discussion about conditions as well. And the last thing I'll note here is that in these conditions, you don't need to reiterate what state law or Metro Council policy already says. This is an opportunity to build on those things. So there was some discussion of middle housing earlier, for instance. You don't need to reiterate existing state laws that are now implemented by cities and counties around middle housing. But if there's something else you want to do, this is an opportunity to do it. Next slide, please. So we wanted to lay out a few of the broad topic areas that you can begin thinking about. This is not limited to what I'm going to present. These are just some ideas. Again, you can supplement existing requirements around housing density, mix, and affordability, Councilor Gonzalez, you mentioned affordability in particular earlier. So this is something that the council has not done in the past, but we can discuss it further over the next several months. Next slide, please. Mix of uses. Part of I mentioned what is required in conditions of approval. You need to describe your expectation for the number of housing units, but also apply any 2040 growth concept designations. So center, corridor, Main Street, those kinds of designations. So this is an opportunity to encourage a mix of uses in any expansion areas. Next slide, please. Industrial lands. In the past, when the council has found a regional need for industrial lands, it's often been, in particular, a need for large industrial sites. And so previous councils have applied requirements for assembling large industrial sites, 50-plus acres, 100-plus acres, to ensure that any lands that get added to the urban growth boundary meet the need that you've identified. And then you can apply additional protections from conflicting uses that go beyond what our code currently requires. Next slide, please. Public engagement expectations. When you are adopting these conditions of approval in the past, council has stated its expectation that cities will do broad-based public engagement as they do the comprehensive planning. So that's another suggestion here about what you may put in these conditions. Next slide, please. And then finally, in the past, you've laid out some deadlines for cities as they've been doing these comprehensive planning exercises. In the last couple decisions, both in the Tigard UGB exchange, as well as the 2018 decision, you stated your expectation that the comprehensive planning be done within 4 years. And that's just, I think, a useful way to emphasize, as Malou mentioned earlier, this notion of readiness, that ultimately the council is adding land to create housing and job opportunities, and you want to see those development outcomes within reasonable timeframes. I think that's my last slide. If you can advance one more and make sure. Oh, must be it. Thank you. So some initial ideas about topics. We don't need to get into detail now about how to write the language, but just to begin thinking about it.
Councilor Nolan, dual hand.
I'll use the manual approach to raising my hand. Thanks. 5 minutes doesn't give this part of the discussion justice, so I think we can give individual feedback offline. It may warrant another group discussion because I think we benefit from the interchange. I want to tag off of Councilor Lewis's reference earlier about infrastructure. And as we look at affordability, looking at it from the individual home purchaser's point of view and also the community's point of view, as we do the analysis, infill with existing infrastructure should be weighed differently than farmland or urban reserves that has no infrastructure in it. I'm sure you take that into account, but I want to emphasize it. In part, as part of that, we tend to think of infrastructure as the stuff that imposes SDCs. And I'd like us to be explicit about including infrastructure for transit. Expanding our urban growth boundary and not making sure that there is a path to providing transit service to those newly added areas, I think would turn our process on its head. That means involving TriMet and a few other local transit agencies, but I don't see a place where we explicitly involve them. We talk a lot to cities, but I'd like to see us adding that to our criteria. I'd like to have a discussion among the council, not just about conditions of approval, but how we establish, how we make the determination with your technical and professional input about whether an expansion is needed at all, is warranted at all. And I referred kind of obliquely to that today, but that's a pretty critical part of this decision.
Councilor Gonzalez?
Thanks, Deputy President Lewis. Yeah, kind of following on that same thread of conversation, I mean, when we call it the urban growth report, right? So I think it's all encompassing to me, and you know, we talk a lot about the units of housing that we're short in the region, and I would love to see how, as we frame this report, how it helps us create an action plan, or if it's a 10-year, 15-year, how are we helping to address that both within, you know, our existing inventory supply, or ceiling on what is existing, and what new additions could do to support that. You know, recognizing that these sites that we add, I mean, they don't realize for a long time, right? Like, obviously development takes a long time, and planning and all that. Just to go back a little bit to the and I didn't want to get too much into detail, because I don't want to bake my little pastry before the community puts all the ingredients in there. But yeah, that's a nice little vision I have in my mind. I know, right? I really want to emphasize the how happy I am to see the slide talk about the affordability requirements, and also the type of housing that we want to incentivize. I mean, like, when I think of a starter home, you know, I think of like 800 square feet, little thing, you know, and or the duplexes, triplexes, et cetera, that help people kind of move up the ladder in that way. Like, just come show us some exciting opportunities. I really want to emphasize to this group, to our stakeholder groups, to maybe not think outside the box. Maybe it's not so outside of the box thinking, but you know, the opportunity to add developable land is, there's so many resources that come to make that a reality. If we can make the private sector and private capital be intentional in some of those ways, then I think we can win without necessarily having to use subsidies, or use the public dollar in that sense. And so I think whenever I find those opportunities, or I feel like there's an opportunity there, I feel like our effort just stretches the dollar, I guess you could say.
Great. Councilor Rosenthal?
Thank you, Vice Chair Lewis. Just a technical question. It's the single point technical question that dogs science all the time. We now have one single point that says our population is, if not shrinking, is stable. How do we incorporate that into projections?
Councilor Rosenthal, we'll incorporate it into projections. That is the glib answer, but I think, you know, talking to our economist, he tends to see a longer trend line where generally he expects things to return to a bit more of a normal in terms of population growth, albeit a bit slower than in the past. You're correct, though, that our region, like others around the country, has lost population in the last couple of years. It's a long-standing trend that deaths now outnumber births in our region and our nation, and that growth comes from domestic migration in our region.
We now have deaths outnumbering births, and out-migration outnumbering in-migration. Right. So we have two factors. That makes it an interesting situation.
Yes. So I think our growth will come from domestic migration in the future, and whether that happens and to what extent is something that we'll be exploring in that forecast. And I think will be a big topic at the stakeholder roundtable. Certainly there are going to be lots of opinions, about what attracts people to this region or what is repelling people from this region. So I think some good discussion to be had there.
So what you're saying, I think, is we think that that's sort of a somewhat anomalous data point at this point in time, and that the long-term trends are likely to continue.
Again, just initial conversations with our economist, he tends to think that there will be a return to growth over the long term. To what degree, I think we'll get into that question more in the coming months.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't want us to get too ahead of ourselves. We don't have that answer yet, but we're working on it.
Okay.
If I could ask a quick question, but even assuming that we had a constant, I mean, we still have a shortage in livable housing units, right? Wrong?
Councilor Gonzalez, you are absolutely correct that we have a shortage of housing. Whether that's a shortage of land is another question.
Of course,
yeah,
that's another guy. Yeah,
yes,
but still,
yeah.
Just to think through that question. All right, thanks.
Anybody else? Okay, well, I think from my perspective, we've kind of talked most at length about the idea, without naming it, that we're talking about housing, but there's also the entire industrial lands conversation fixed within the jobs side of the equation. But I kind of look at the conditions of approval needing to cover that no matter where you live, no matter where you work, you also need to have access to nature, access to good health care, access to schools, and access to fresh food close to home and close to where you work. So I would just look at those as social infrastructure on top of the basic physical infrastructure, built environment pieces that are naturally coming up as part of our equation.
Councilor Lewis?
Yes.
If I may, I just wanted to sort of name a theme that I'm hearing and, say it back to you all just to be clear. I think a lot of the questions that we've heard today and a lot of the discussions have been around what assumptions are going into this report? What data are we looking at? How, what growth assumptions are we including? And I think, to zoom back up, sort of the purpose of the stakeholder roundtable, the purpose of coming to you early on in the process is to really provide transparency around what those assumptions are so that when the report spits out a number that everybody gets stuck on, people understand the assumptions and the decisions that we made in deciding which assumptions to use to arrive at a number or at a conclusion. And so I just wanted to say that out loud, that we are really committed to being transparent around what's inside that box that results in a computation that then feels very technical. But these are excellent questions, and I think all aspects of how we eventually will arrive at a recommendation for you next year.
Thank you. Now, do you have any more PowerPoints?
We are good. And Deputy Council President Lewis, I appreciate you letting us give that second PowerPoint. We're really trying to be sure that we aren't talking for too long and you all have an opportunity to give us feedback. We also felt like it was important to have this short conversation about the conditions of approval now because we do have local partners who are putting together hopefully proposals to bring land into the urban growth boundary, and it helps them to have a sense of what you all are thinking. So thank you for that time as well. And we appreciate all of your thoughts. Send your ideas of who you want us to talk to Erin, and we really appreciate your time.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks again, team. And at this point, let's go ahead and have Marta, you and your team come up because we're going to transition into our next agenda item. So for our work session, item 3, garbage recycling systems plan. Metro's Waste Prevention and Environmental Services Department plays a critical role in overseeing and planning our region's waste system. This includes cleanup services for dump garbage, education and information services for the public, and partnering with governments, businesses, and communities across 3 counties to reduce waste. Last week, we looked closely at our regulatory authority, had our attorney with us, And we also looked at investments to date and discussed council priorities to further guide implementation of the regional waste plan and to inform investment for next year's budget. Today's work session will build on that discussion by providing additional context to support council decisions on the garbage and recycling system facilities plan and how the plan will help inform Metro's long-term investment priorities. Our council president can't be here today, but she asked me to share some remarks on her behalf. She wants to underscore that any decisions we make or direction we give related to this project be centered around achieving our mission as an organization and within WPES to reduce waste. I encourage us all to ask the question of whether or not we are advancing policies that meaningfully address waste reduction or increase our dependency on an ever-increasing waste flow. Those are her remarks. And with that, I will say it is an opportunity for us to have a real discussion because I think it's been, kind of nesting dolls of conversation. And with today's layer pointed towards the system facilities plan, we've, over a course of 3 conversations, touched on nearly everything to have a comprehensive view of what actually goes on within WPS. So thank you for being here. I'll let you introduce your presentation and your team.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Good morning again. My name is Marta McGuire, a Waste Prevention and Environmental Services Director, and I have here with me Esty Siegel and Luis Sandoval, who are part of our Metro Planning team working on the System Facilities Plan. We also have Lindsay Lopez and Joey Velasquez, who is online, who are part of Jacobs, who have been supporting the technical work on the plan development. We appreciate the opportunity to engage with you again today, and this is a beginning of conversations around the Systems Facilities Plan, building on the discussions that we had last week. Next slide. As Council President Lewis mentioned, last week we focused our discussion on the regional waste plan outcomes and council priorities that are listed here: shared prosperity, healthy environment, and excellent, accessible, and resilient garbage and recycling system. You expressed support for these outcomes and share guidance on your priorities and areas for further discussion. Next slide. We also discussed the life cycle approach to managing products and materials through their life, especially to prevent waste. We also touched on our levers for advancing progress and Metro's authorities and responsibilities. A key intersecting project for advancing change is the System Facilities Plan. While the Regional Waste Plan provides the policy guidance, the Systems Facilities Plan will provide a long-range infrastructure plan and key investments to fulfill the Regional Waste Plan goals, including improving reuse, recycling, and garbage services that really comprise the blue portion of the graphic that you see here. The Systems Facilities Plan essentially is designed to provide options to council to decide on future infrastructure investments. Next slide. Today is an opportunity to hear about the System Facilities Plan, to remind you about the work completed so far, understand the gaps identified in the technical research, and how they have led to developing scenarios to help evaluate the trade-offs of paths forward. It's important to keep in mind that we are very much at the concept level, and these scenarios are designed to give us a larger framework to consider the trade-offs of different approaches that council may choose to take. You have viewed the scenarios in prior iterations, and we will preview the updated scenarios today before we share them with stakeholders to gather input. Next week, we're very excited to host an international panel of experts to share innovative solutions that their country or region have implemented to reduce waste and ensure equitable and accessible services. And they are really intended to prompt and inspire thinking to plan for our own future system. The symposium and input collected with the workshop going along with it will be brought back to you so that council may have a fuller discussion or discussions on the scenarios coupled with that input. And we'll share more on the next steps at the end of the presentation. So again, this is just the beginning of the conversations with you on the System Facilities Plan. Today is focused to give you that background information. We won't be jumping into depth on the scenarios because those discussions will be forthcoming. So with that, I will turn it over to Esty.
Thanks, Marta, and hello, counselors. My name is Esty Siegel. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm a principal planner and one of the project managers on the system facility plan. So the next slide, please. So this project is intended to help Metro determine the right set of capital investments to achieve the goals in the regional waste plan and meet key outcomes that you see on this slide of reducing the amount of waste going to landfill, improving the quality and access to facilities and services, keeping services affordable and cost impacts to residents low, and improving the resiliency of facilities to natural hazards. Our transfer stations today are good at handling and processing garbage, but there's growing demand and need for more reuse, repair, and recycling options to help reduce the overall amount of waste we consume and send to landfills. Next slide, please. So we've completed a lot of work and done extensive engagement in the first 3 phases of this plan. As a reminder, Council approved a work plan for this project by resolution in the spring of 2022. The values and outcomes were then discussed and developed with Metro advisory committees, and they are brought to you for review and endorsement last fall. In phase 2, we engaged with project stakeholders and to identify current and future facility gaps and brought a report on the identified gaps to Council in early 2023. I think that's the last time we were here before you. So we're now in phase 3, and we have completed critical technical analysis research to further identify the gaps, which is really the focus of what we'd like to share with you today. We'd like to explain how this research, paired with our engagement findings, have led to the creation of 4 draft scenarios that will be shared with stakeholders next week at a symposium that Marta mentioned. And we plan to return to you with a summary of the input that we receive at the symposium and a staff recommendation at the end of this year. At that point, we will ask Council to decide on a preferred scenario or a combination of actions in scenarios to further build out, detail, and develop a financing and implementation plan in phase 4. Council will be asked to endorse the final investment plan in phase 5. Next slide, please. For a brief review, these are the values guiding the plan, and they mirror the values and principles that were developed as part of the 2030 Regional Waste Plan, with one new value on tribal consultation. So under these values, there are 35 specific outcomes that fall under each one, which are measurable and specific to what the plan is expected to achieve once it's adopted and during its implementation. These values and outcomes were also the basis for developing scenario evaluation criteria, which we'll touch on in just a minute. Next slide. This is a quick catch-up on the engagement work we've done to date. In phase 2, we met with the Project Community Advisory Group monthly, held 4 individual stakeholder roundtables, and engaged with Metro's advisory committees. These meetings were focused on collecting information on current and future facility and service gaps as experienced by people in our region today. Our goal was to engage various affected stakeholders while prioritizing community members who are highly impacted by the current garbage and recycling system, but who have had limited access to influence decision-making in the past. We summarized the gaps that were identified from these conversations in an engagement summary report that we presented to you in the end of January this year, and we have listed the most commonly identified gaps here on this slide. Next slide, please. So as we started our technical research in phase 3, we continued to do targeted engagement with stakeholders, and I'd like to share just a bit of what we heard from these groups on the screen. We held a meeting with local government administrators in partnership with the Recycling Modernization Act team regarding future recycling depots, and heard from all of them the desire for more depots in their jurisdictions in the future. Most of the jurisdictions that we talked to, 7 out of 9, reported that they did not foresee an appetite for managing the future depots themselves. However, everyone agreed that more discussion is necessary, including with elected officials. We also met with several reuse and repair business leaders to better understand their understanding of facility and service gaps in the region and how different scenarios could be designed to address them. And in this picture is one of the workshops we held with them in March. These leaders said they would like to see more emphasis on reuse and repair in the future, and they even had the idea to rename the plan the Reuse, Repair, Recycling, and Garbage System Facilities Plan. They want to be part of the conversation and sit at the table with us to design how reuse and repair could be incorporated in future facilities. To increase the flow of materials to reuse and repair businesses, they report that more public funding is needed and reminded us that their businesses are not just redistribution centers, but that they provide support to transition people into stable housing and good jobs. We also conducted interviews with industry representatives in early May to understand what future investments the private sector may be planning and also about future partnerships. And we heard from them that many facility operators do not wish to offer public self-haul services at their sites. A few representatives said that Metro's role is best in handling services where it's difficult for the private sector to compete. They generally have low interest in owning or operating facilities that accept household hazardous waste. There is interest in recycling depots as envisioned in the Recycling Modernization Act, and private industry is currently operating many of these around the region. Many facility operators say they have plans or are interested in expanding and making new facility investments in the future. These investments are often dependent on the ability to secure future volumes of materials, such as through expanded organics programs and through the Recycling Modernization Act depots. So I'll now hand the presentation over to Luis and Lindsay to talk about the outcomes of the technical research and analysis that we completed in phase 3 and how we've paired this with engagement and has led to the scenarios that we'll be discussing at the symposium. Luis?
Thank you, Esty, and good afternoon, councilors. My name is Luis Sandoval. I am a solid waste planner in the Waste Prevention and Environmental Services Department. I would like to start this portion of the presentation with an overview of the gap analysis and how the technical gap assessment fits within that body of work. As Esty described earlier, the gap analysis in phase 2 of the project aim to take a comprehensive look at the region's reuse, recycling, and garbage system to identify gaps in facilities. To do this, we used a combination of engagement activities with project stakeholders and technical research. To complement the engagement work, the project team conducted a technical assessment of gaps in facilities for different types of materials and customers. This work was done by our consultant team, which is led by Jacobs Engineering in collaboration with Metro staff in WPES as well as the Research Center. In many ways, the technical analysis complemented most of the gaps identified through engagement with data and geospatial analysis. For example, for most of the gaps in access that we heard from stakeholders, we were able to estimate driving times to facilities, to the nearest facilities, and quantify how much of a gap there is using a consistent methodology. In other ways, the technical analysis expanded the engagement work by exploring areas that were not discussed in detail by project stakeholders or not covered at all. In particular, this allowed us to assess gaps in facilities for commercial haulers, for example, facilities that take residential organics from haulers. As well as business food waste, yard debris, and garbage. Next slide, please. Given that the ultimate goal of the system facilities plan is to identify the facility investments that Metro should make in the reuse, recycling, and garbage system, the technical gap analysis has been one of the key ingredients in the planning process. The main purpose of the technical analysis within this process was to help identify the areas of the system that had the most critical infrastructure needs and where Metro can have the greatest impact. Now, in phase 3 of the project, which is where we are today, the project team used the information from the technical analysis and the engagement work to design 4 alternative scenarios that explore different ways in which Metro could help fulfill the values and outcomes established in phase 1 that Esty described, as well as address the facility gaps found in phase 2. Before we continue to discuss the details of the technical analysis, I would like to give a brief overview of these scenarios And this will help us review a couple of examples later with Lindsay that show how the scenarios address specific facility gaps in the region. Next slide, please. So this slide shows the short names and brief descriptions of the 4 scenarios the project has drafted, which will be shown at the Reuse, Recycling, and Garbage Symposium next week. The scenarios consist of 1 baseline or business as usual scenario, and then 3 alternative scenarios that capture 3 different ways or approaches that Metro could take to address the facility gaps in the region and advance the project's values and outcomes. The 3 alternative scenarios were designed to present a range of approaches that are very different from each other so that they can more clearly highlight differences and trade-offs in terms of cost, feasibility, impact to the environment, and other factors. On one corner, so to speak, we have the full-service scenario in which Metro would invest in building large regional reuse facilities and transfer stations. While on an opposite corner, under the no-build scenario, Metro would not build any new facilities and instead would use a combination of policies and programs and investments in existing facilities to address facility gaps in the region. And then in a fourth corner, the distributed scenario, which envisions, we have the distributed scenario, which envisions Metro building a network of 2 types of facilities. One type would be focused on serving the general public, and another type on commercial haulers. All facilities in this scenario would be smaller than the typical modern transfer station that is designed to serve multiple customers in one location. The project team fully expects that the ideal or most preferred scenario could be a combination of different elements from all the scenarios, because we have created the scenarios to be on kind of extreme corners as much as we could. Because the scenarios are complex and take some time to understand, we have developed a discussion guide that will be shared later this week with symposium participants. And the guide lays out the types of investments proposed under each scenario and also compares the scenarios in terms of evaluation criteria, which brings me to the next slide, please. This slide shows the 13 criteria the project developed to assess and compare the draft scenarios that Esti mentioned before. The criteria are based on the project values and outcomes and are summarized here, grouped under 6 high-level categories: environment, access, affordability, equity, jobs, and resilience. Over the past few months, the project's consultant team, with some help from Metro staff, have developed methodologies and data models for assessing the scenarios against each of the 13 criteria shown here. The full assessment of the 4 scenarios is part of the information in the discussion guide and will be further reviewed at the symposium. And then the guide and additional technical information will also be available on the project's website. Next slide, please. So now I would like to return to the technical analysis to dive in a little deeper. What did we do in this technical analysis? In the first place, the analysis focused on the transfer and reload sector, which we define as the facilities that accept materials for reuse, recycling, composting, or landfilling directly from the general public or from commercial haulers. The analysis did not focus on end markets like landfills, paper mills, or plastic recycling companies. This is because historically, with the exception of Metro Paint, which is indeed an end market for paint recycling, Metro has been more active in the transfer sector, and the region has relied more on the private and nonprofit sectors to process materials for reuse, recycling, composting, and landfilling. In the end, the technical analysis assessed gaps for 14 groups of facilities, organized by material stream, accepted from either the public or from commercial customers. In total, the analysis looked at 116 facilities in the system, ranging from transfer stations and material recovery facilities to thrift stores, paint stores, and other retail establishments that accept materials from the public for reuse or recycling. Before we narrowed down the analysis to those 14 groups of facilities, we had to prioritize what to focus on because there are definitely many more facilities than the 116 we included. We did this by considering a combination of factors, including whether the material has a high impact on the environment and human health, such as food waste and electronics, whether it was a major theme identified through engagement, such as household hazardous waste and self-haul garbage, whether we knew from experience that there is already a low number of facilities in the system, such as the facilities that accept residential organics from haulers, and whether the material is or will be covered soon by an extended producer responsibility program like electronics and mattresses. Next slide, please. Each of the 14 facility groups included in the analysis was assessed for gaps in terms of access, cost differences, and disaster resilience, utilizing a high, medium, and low scoring approach, which is outlined in the scoring rubric on the slide and is also discussed in more detail in a summary report that is available on our website.
Can I ask you a quick question?
Yes.
Just, so this includes public and private facilities, right?
Yes,
Okay,
there are
thank you.
116 facilities, yes. And it includes facilities mostly within the metro boundary, but also some outside the boundary that serve the region.
Perfect, thank you.
The three areas, access, cost differences, and disaster resilience, align with the overall project goals to ensure equitable distribution of and access to services and to maintain service affordability. Disaster resilience is also one of the areas prioritized in the project's values and outcomes, and we feel confident we could analyze all 14 facility groups consistently because of the availability of data from the Oregon Department of Geology and Mineral Industries, DOGAMI. In terms of access, we looked at how long it takes customers to drive to facilities, as well as how close those facilities are to public transport, walking, and biking infrastructure. Cost difference evaluated how consistent the costs to customers for within each sector are throughout the region. We did that by comparing the lowest and highest fees charged by any facility within each group and using rates posted on facility websites or at the facilities gates. Disaster resilience look at whether facilities are located in areas at high risk of flooding or earthquake damage. And so now I'd like to turn it over to Lindsay Lopez and Joey Velasquez from Jacobs Engineering to talk about the results of the technical analysis. And I just want to mention that Lindsay, Joey, and others in the consultant team led by Jacobs have been working very hard on the system facilities plan project, including the gap analysis and the development of the scenarios, which we are very grateful for.
Thank you, Luis. Next slide, please. So good afternoon, counselors. My name is Lindsay Lopez. I use she, her pronouns. I am also joined by my colleague, Joey Velasquez. He's virtual, so I don't know if you can see him, but he's here with us. Thanks, Joey. He'll help answer some of the questions as we get through this material. But I am the consulting team's project manager for Jacobs, and I've been working a lot with the whole Metro team and a variety of other consultants, so it's a pleasure to be here today. So now I want to walk you through, you heard a little bit from Luis about the methodology that was utilized to go through this analysis. It was very complex, as you can see just from this graphic on the screen, the 14 sectors and the 2 different customer types, the general public and the commercial haulers, are kind of summarized here. The red items indicate something that has a high gap level, yellow indicates a medium gap level, and green indicates the low. So out of the 14 different sectors assessed, 2 didn't have any gaps at all, 9 had at least 1 high gap, and the other 3 had at least 1 medium gap. So we're gonna walk through this a little bit. You hopefully got a copy of this report in the agenda packet. There's a lot of material there, but we're gonna highlight a little bit of that material. So next slide, please.
So let's look at this from highlighting some of the regional trends that we saw. We assessed the entire region, but there were definitely a few regional trends that we noticed as we were looking through the data. The technical gap assessment results showed that the north and western portions of Washington County, which include Forest Grove, Beaverton, Aloha, Hillsborough, and Cornelius, had general public gaps for the following sectors: mattresses for reuse, building material for reuse, household hazardous waste, mixed dry waste, and mixed garbage. So each of these that are shown on the screen had at least one high or medium gap, as shown on that previous slide. The other thing that I want to point out to you on the screen is this map here, and this is highlighting that North and West Washington County portion of the region. The darker blue shows longer travel times. So as Luis mentioned, we did a lot of travel time assessment, and you can really see those really dark regions there in that most western part of the region. Next slide, please.
Question?
Yes.
Is your travel time here estimated incorporating population density? So if it's 90, if our target is 95%, that depends on how many people live per acre or square mile or whatever we use.
So this was the travel time for anyone in the region within the closest facility. So,
Yeah, so the travel times do take into account population for facilities that accept materials from the public. So we use a metric of what's the percentage of the population within 20 minutes of the nearest public facility.
The proportion of the land or the population?
Population, the share of the population. And then for facilities that accept materials from commercial haulers, we use the area, the percentage of the area within 20 minutes of the nearest commercial facility, because haulers serve business, industrial, as well as residential customers. So for sectors that focus on residential customers is the population weighted measure, and then for commercial haulers is the area weighted measure.
Thanks.
Just a clarifying question is the time estimate based on like peak travel time or like what because if I go to my transfer station, it could be 10 minutes or 30 minutes.
Yes, and so we use the travel model from the research center, and they have the estimates, and we use the uncongested, or I'm gonna have to go back to you whether it's uncongested or congested traffic times, morning time. It was between 8 and 10 a.m., I think.
thank you. All right, so now on this slide, this one is showing another portion of the region. Well, it's the same portion of the region, but this time it's for the commercial haulers. And this particular area had high or medium gaps for mixed recycling, food waste, mixed food, and yard debris, mixed dry waste, and mixed garbage. Among some of these on the screen, you see high gaps for disaster resilience under mixed recycling, high access gaps for food waste, medium access gaps for mixed food waste and yard debris, high for cost difference for yard debris, high cost difference for mixed dry waste, and high for both cost and access under mixed garbage. And again, we're seeing a similar map here with that travel time, the darker colors showing the longer travel time. All of those different items that are shown on the bullets of the screen, they were overlaid to give you this map as well. Next slide, please. All right, so now we're looking at the East Multnomah County portions. The technical gap assessment results showed that East Multnomah County and portions of Clackamas County, which includes Troutdale, Gresham, Damascus, and Happy Valley, had general public gaps for mixed garbage, construction and dry waste, household hazardous waste, and recyclables. The map on this slide again shows that overlay of those four sectors that are shown on the slide. And it is again showing that, travel times in the easternmost part of the region, as you can see with those dark colors of the map, being the longest travel times. Next slide, please.
Okay, so now we're still in the East Multnomah County and portions of Clackamas County region, but now looking at it from the commercial haulers perspective. The technical gap assessment results showed that the East Multnomah County and portions of Clackamas County had commercial hauler gaps for mixed garbage, construction and dry waste, yard debris, residential organics, food waste, and commingled recyclables. And again, you see those larger, the darker colored of blue there on the eastern portions of this section of the region. Next slide. So now that we looked at the regional kind of trends, I want to show you, when you're looking at the report, you have each of the sectors that was shown, that the two different types of customers, the general public and the commercial haulers. You have the 14 different sectors. And for each of those that had a medium or high or a gap, we have details about each of those. So now we're going to show you a couple of examples. This is one that had high levels of gaps across the three different indicators for access, cost, and resilience. And this is looking at the mixed garbage sector for the general public. This slide shows the summary conclusions for each indicator, as well as the map that also shows facilities that accept garbage from the general public. There are 3 facilities in the region that currently accept mixed garbage from individuals, businesses, and institutions, and that's Forest Grove Transfer Station, owned by Waste Management, Inc., Metro Central Transfer Station in North Portland, and Metro South Transfer Station in Oregon City. In this map, the travel time to the nearest facility again is shown, and the light blue shows the less time, darker again represents the longer time. Next slide, please.
For the mixed garbage, did you cross tab this with availability or requirement for curbside pickup?
Not in this particular part of the assessment, no. This is just looking at facilities that accept that mixed garbage from self-haul or general public.
So if someone has access to curbside garbage collection and recycling, it's less important that they have someplace nearby to do self-haul mixed garbage. Bulky waste, different question, but if they're choosing to do self-haul instead of use the available curbside,
Yeah, that's correct.
That should go into our thinking.
Yeah, and I think you'll see that as we look more at the scenarios that look at some of those alternatives, looking at more curbside, but this part of the technical analysis was really looking at facilities and the access to them.
Yeah, also with the, just want to check an assumption I have. For the Forest Grove Transfer Station owned by the private company, my understanding is that that site charges some of the highest rates in the entire Pacific Northwest state of Oregon. So it's like not very, I mean, it's there, but it's accessible, but is it accessible? I don't know. Anyway, just want to put that number out there.
No, I think that's a great point to call out and help connect the dots of this big picture that we're painting. But just to Councilor Nolan's point, what you just identified directly connects to some of the options that are in the no-build scenario, that you could require service because it's not currently required. So you'll kind of see these dots being connected. So appreciate that observation and comment.
And those 3 indicators, we did look at cost difference because we knew that was an indicator. So thank you, Councilor Gonzalez. All right, so this slide here, mixed garbage was one of the sectors under the general public that had a high gap level in all of the 3 indicators. This table shows how the scenarios addressed this particular gap. Starting from the left column, the full service scenario includes 4 new full service transfer stations that will take self-haul household garbage from the public. In the middle column, you can see that this scenario includes 3 mid-sized transfer stations that accept household garbage from public customers, as well as up to 5 new reuse and recycling centers that also accept small amounts of this material. And in the last column, the no-build scenario provides funding for capital improvements at private facilities and also includes policies to reduce the demand for facilities that accept this material, requiring the expansion of curbside programs and mandatory curbside subscription. Next slide, please. So again, this is another close look at one of those items that has the 3 high gap levels for access, cost, resilience. This shows the results for the commercial hauler food waste sector, which represents the food scraps collected by haulers from businesses. The slide summary conclusions for each indicator, as well as the map also shows facilities that accept food waste from commercial haulers. There are 3 facilities in the greater Portland region that currently accept business food waste from commercial haulers: Pride Recycling Company, Metro Central Transfer Station, and Willamette Resources, Inc. The food waste received at these facilities is sent to other locations for processing. The stability of the mandatory food scraps program relies on access to composting, anaerobic digestion, and other end markets that can process the material into valuable products. Most facilities processing food scraps in the region cannot effectively remove contaminants. This can be mitigated by installing processing equipment that can effectively remove contaminants at transfer stations, except commercial food scraps. The ability to create clean food scraps supports access to multiple end markets and helps ensure program stability. In this map, the travel time to the nearest facility for this type of material is also shown. Again, that light blue represents less time, darker represents longer travel time. Next slide, please. So food waste was one of the sectors under commercial haulers that had high gap levels in all 3 indicators, and this table shows how the scenarios address that particular gap. Starting from the left column on this slide, the full service scenario includes 4 full service transfer stations that take organics for depackaging, reload, or processing at Metro Central, and Metro Central is renovated to become a commercial organics hub. This is common across all of the scenarios. In the middle column under distributed scenario, this also includes 3 new mid-sized transfer stations that will accept food waste from haulers, and Metro Central again have that organics hub. And in the last column, the no-build scenario, it provides funding for capital improvements at private facilities and including that Metro Central hub. So now I'm going to hand the presentation back to Esty to wrap us up and take any questions.
Thanks, Lindsay, and we can go to the next slide. Thanks. So yeah, thanks again to Lindsay and Joey and the Jacobs team who've been working really hard on this and modeling. And what I wanted to just wrap us up with a couple slides. As Luis explained, we have developed plausible scenarios based on engagement and technical gaps that we just summarized. And so we're now ready to discuss the scenarios, gather input, questions, and feedback at this upcoming symposium next week, which will give us the opportunity to explore approaches and hear from some panelists about approaches from across the globe. We're inviting local government, industry, community leaders to provide input on the scenarios and preferred approach. So Luis also mentioned a discussion guide that will provide context and background for the project, a comparison of the scenarios, including information on estimated costs to build and/or implement each scenario at a conceptual level, because these are conceptual scenarios, and options to access more information in linked documents to facilitate the time and interest of participants. And that is coming out the end of this week. We're working hard with consultants to get that ready and have it be really something that people can read and understand and access, again, different levels of information. Next slide, please. So, as a reminder, we will be back before you a week from today on September 26, really with bringing 4 international experts on innovative infrastructure and systems in different parts of the globe. You'll be getting a staff report on that any day now. Panelists will be sharing their experiences with you in the area of facility planning and managing systems that support waste reduction, climate pollution reduction, and workforce development. And this will be an opportunity to consider ways to advance the values and outcomes of our plan and project, and in particular, the alternative scenarios that we are laying out for investing in facilities in the future. So the next day, on September 27th, we will be reviewing the scenarios in detail at a symposium and facilitating discussions in small mixed stakeholder groups and seeking input and feedback on the scenarios. And we will be asking what are the advantages of each scenario, what aspects of each scenario do you like least and why, and what changes you would make to improve each scenario. And we'll also have an online survey for participants to complete at the end of the symposium, which will be used for analysis and summarizing and reporting back to you with input on what we hear that day. We have more than 120 participants registered for the symposium, including a mix of local government staff, elected officials, business and industry, nonprofit, reuse, repair organizations and leaders, and community members. And lastly, we have invited you to and encourage you to join us on a couple tours that we are coordinating for our international panelists on Tuesday afternoon and next week, Tuesday afternoon and Thursday morning. And the tours are really meant to showcase some of the innovative reuse businesses and organizations that are here in our region and at the request of the panelists who are traveling far and wide to come here and want to learn about our region too. We look forward to coming back to you, Council, at the end of the year with a summary of what we've heard and learned at the symposium about the scenarios. And we will be following up in meetings with our partners after the symposium and with MPAC. And we will be coming back to recommend one scenario or a combination of scenario elements to move forward for us to further develop in phase 4 of the plan. So, thank you.
I wanted to add just one more thing, and we do have a couple of questions for council to consider. We don't currently have a long-range infrastructure plan for our facilities or for the region. And I just want to acknowledge that we're really innovating in this space and learning as we go. The scenario approach was really designed to provide a framework for discussion to better understand the trade-offs of moving forward. And I just want to recognize the hard work it is to innovate in this space, especially for the garbage and recycling system. It's a common practice, one that we're really good at in transportation, but just this team has been working incredibly hard over the last, almost 2 years in developing the technical analysis and research that is kind of culminating in this symposium. So I just want to appreciate that and share that with council. And we're really looking forward to having this conversation with you and being able to share out the discussion guide. We had very exciting that more than 120 people want to talk about garbage and recycling and are interested in attending this symposium. So we're super excited to have that much interest in having representatives from, across many different stakeholder groups come and attend. So with that, we do have a couple of questions for council that are on the next slide, and we'll turn it back to Deputy Council President Lewis.
Great, thank you so much. Councilors, responses to these questions or questions based off of the presentation? Councilor Rosendahl.
And thank you, Vice Chair Lewis. First of all, I won't pretend to understand. It's a very complex process that you've undergone, and I will not pretend to understand all the nuances. I have to think it through. I'd like to get some more materials and spend a little bit more time studying it. But the first question occurs to me, actually, there's probably two questions. The two scenarios, the one that has 4 large facilities, and the other one has 3 smaller facilities. Now, a large facility handles presumably more mixed waste, and the smaller facilities would handle less mixed waste. So 4 large facilities would seem to have a larger impact on the available waste for the private haulers or the private consortiums. And so isn't it likely that they will have somewhat more opposition to that particular kind of scenario because they're going to be losing waste volume compared to the other scenario? And then the other question related to that is investment in private facilities. Is this implies a whole bunch of interesting negotiations and contractual ramifications in, as well as maybe they don't have they have their own facility plans and their own expansion plans and their own size limitations. So this could be somewhat complicated, is that correct? I see nods, okay, I think that's the answer.
The question was, is this complicated? We're on our third work session. I've got a question, then I saw a physical hand and I don't, yep, there we go. Okay, but I'm gonna go first. Because I wasn't prepared to be in this seat. So we have a current state analysis of mixed recycling, but we're going through recycling modernization. So mixed recycling is going to be a future state within 3 years. How much does that future state change the analysis of what the facilities can handle?
May I address Councilor Rosenthal's question before?
Oh, yeah, okay.
I just wanted to mention that it is important, I want to highlight, because that is the purpose of those opposite corners of the scenarios, because we are not only addressing gaps in access, but we heard strong, loud and clear from stakeholders about cost differences. So you're correct that building 4 large facilities would be a way to address those cost differences, but with a trade-off, which is pulling material from private facilities in some cases. In others, not so much, because metro transfer stations are focusing on materials like organics that are not, other facilities don't want to
It depends on the waste stream.
Exactly, it depends on the waste stream, but for some materials, yes. And then on the other side of this spectrum, in the no-build scenario, to address that cost difference gap, we're proposing regulating rates charged by private facilities and public facilities in the system. So there's a trade-off, right?
Okay.
And as you pointed out, it gets complicated. And then that no-build scenario does have those investment in private facilities, and you pointed to all the challenges that, some of the challenges that would come along with taking that approach. So just wanted to emphasize the opposite corners, and so I've said before, there are things to like and things not to like about each of those scenarios depending on who you are. Okay. And Councilor Lewis, with the Recycling Modernization Act, it will cover the mixed recycling, especially for commercial haulers. So it would reduce tipping fees at material recovery facilities for haulers. And so we did include it in the analysis because in the Recycling Modernization Act, there's a possibility that public agencies could, for example, expand reload facilities. So in certain areas of the region, haulers might have to drive too far to the nearest material recovery facility. And in that case, we could use that as a potential opportunity for Metro or other public agencies to invest in reload facilities that would have partial funding from producers. And then the other side is the depots. So the RMA contemplates a lot of depots in the region for the covered materials. And the covered materials are a large, I think it's an estimate of 95 or more % of the material that is collected in the blue bin in curbside. But it does not cover the whole recycling stream, right? So we're talking about depots for covered materials under the Recycling Modernization Act that would be partially funded by producers. So that's why we consider that group, and we are we're including that in the plan with that kind of lingering question of how is the implementation going to look like in 3 years. We're getting to know more details of that implementation every month now, but until we know exactly how much would producers fund depots. And then our interest too would be in the one-stop shop location. So the Metro, that is one of the roles Metro could play, is to provide depots where people can go and do bottle drop or RMA material or reuse material or different types of material, so that people, this is something we heard through engagement, people want that convenience factor of not having to first go here, then go there for different types of materials. So those are the questions that we still have or are exploring with the scenarios.
Okay, so I guess what I hear you say is like, we have these access maps with the light blue all the way to the white, and we're looking at this plan pretty much as though our investment could change that, but you have not factored into the fact that these depots will naturally change some of the access even without any additional investment or access from us. It will
Correct.
naturally happen no matter what.
In the no-build scenario, that is the assumption. We just leave it up to the producers under the RMA, we leave it up to producers under the mattress program, under the electronics program, and they can have multiple depots, not necessarily co-located, and that's the no-build scenario, and then, of course, the baseline, because it's the default status quo. So we're considering the range, and then in the full service, we would take a stronger role in building a couple of the depots that the RMA producers are required to build, because they are required to build many depots in the region, and we are only focusing on like 4, 5 here and there. So it would only be 4 or 5 of like, I believe it's 47, up to 47 in the region that the producers are required to build for RMA materials.
I think to just add, one reason we invited our speaker from British Columbia, the panelist that's coming next week, is because of their progress with extended producer responsibility. And he's got a lot to say about this and depots and how the private and public system fits together. So I think let's take advantage of asking questions about how it's rolled out up there in terms of roles too.
I'm super excited for that. And I guess I'm very particularly interested in extended producer responsibility in depots, but I'm also acutely aware that we make a lot of decisions without thinking that we're one layer in a layer cake, and I'm seeing at least 3 different layers of investment that we can't control the other 2. I mean, to the extent that we could set a policy that mandates that the state has already, mandated, that's control, but where something is exactly located, not for us to say. Councilor Nolan, Councilor Wong, Councilor Gonzalez. Councilor
Thanks,
Nolan.
Madam President. Operating from the premise that an underlying goal is reduce, what reduction levels in different waste streams have you incorporated into your projections?
So that will be coming up in the discussion guide, is the first material that will come up. And then I can tell you from the results of the assessment that Jacobs did, it's mainly coming from organics. That is a high impact material, high environmental impact material. And so the scenarios propose investments in that area, and that yields a lot of environmental benefit, as well as materials for reuse. Those are the 2 largest categories that I remember, and I'm not sure if
That's what I was going to say too.
Joey would like to.
I understand that this is a facilities planning process, but Marta, you mentioned earlier use of our regulatory authority. I would recommend and prefer that we squeeze as much reduction out of non-facilities capacity we have, like regulation and other, like pricing maybe, before we start thinking about a plan that could potentially be a multi-$100 million capital investment. If you've done that already, I'd love to hear about it and we can take it offline. If you haven't, it seems to me that before we decide we need a 5,000 bed prison, that we figure out how many prisoners we're gonna have or how we can reduce the prison population through social services and education and other things before we build that. Let me see, county jail.
I appreciate that question and observation. And when we look at the scenarios, the no-build scenario really speaks to what are the other levers that we have. Regulation is one of them. So requiring services, curbside, or different type of collection programs would then reduce the need for other types of facilities to be built. So it is inherent within these scenarios, and there are trade-offs to that approach that these scenarios will help articulate. So that is a part of the discussion that we will be having.
Okay, quick follow-up. It's related. I noticed on one of the early slides, you've got job creation as one of the measurement points. I'm struggling to see how the facilities change net job availability or labor force positions in the region. They might shift it between public and private employment. To me, that doesn't count as job creation. The way, almost in an inverse approach to this, the way to increase employment numbers is to decrease mechanization and productivity of the facilities, which contradicts a goal of affordability. So I'm interested in how you've brought all those hydraulics together, or how you're approaching that.
So what, do you want me to start? Yeah. So one of the things that you will see in more in the discussion guide and the attachments are how that was looked at in more detail. But I will say that utilizing some, studies that have been done on economics for job creation, looking at kind of jobs associated with like disposal facilities associated with solid waste versus reuse and recycling, it is shown that there are quite a bit more jobs created when you have the recycling and the reuse sector more within your region. And so that was one of the factors that was looked at as we were comparing the different scenarios. We looked at the kinds of facilities that would be part of each of those, the kinds of materials that would be more of a focus at those facilities, and then that was utilized to kind of estimate the general overall jobs that would be created because of your focus on that reuse, repair, and recycling.
And I would add that we are not considering only public sector jobs, only metro jobs. So part of one of the two criteria in that area is total jobs in the system, and it's based on these studies, right? So we are shifting tons away from landfilling, which employs less than 1 FTE per ton landfill, for example, to more to being reused or composted or recycled. And then when you get into recycling, the factors that based on like EPA studies and other studies start getting into 7 FTE per ton recovered. And for reuse, it's as much as 30 FTE per ton of material recovered, because landfills are very not labor intensive, right? And then reuse is very labor intensive. And so those are the shifts. And so those are the jobs that are created across the chain. Metro would play a role mainly in the collection, acceptance of material, in the transfer sector, but it generates jobs at other facilities downstream, so at the end market side of things.
And that provokes what I think is a quick follow-up, or at least a pin in our discussion. Who pays for those additional jobs?
We do.
It depends on the...
I mean, the royal we, but how is the funding for those additional jobs collected?
Well, that points to the other point you made. Yes, ultimately, and I think you mentioned before in a previous session, the pocket is the same.
Right.
And then the money comes. But there's different revenue models. So in the reuse model, it's people buying stuff from reuse organizations, or reuse organizations that don't have that revenue generating model rely on donations, right? Then you have recycling that is paid by curbside ratepayers. Composting partially offsets processing costs through the sale of the end product. And so those are the different,
Plus the tipping fees at each of the
yeah,
facilities.
and then those translate into bills to businesses, to residents, yes. Yeah.
Thanks.
Perfect, Counselor Wong?
Thank you. Gosh, lots to think about here. But I think before we kind of get more deeply into the weeds, I just have some kind of big picture questions, particularly around kind of the technical methodology. Our goals from, my colleagues and I that we've set over the last couple of weeks are, we really want to be reducing vehicle miles traveled, and we also want less waste coming into our landfills. But I'm just like in the analysis, like the access piece is, access within 20 minutes by car. And I'm wondering if that's like, I understand building more accessibility, having more, transfer stations and things like that reduces that. But are there possibilities and scenarios where, we don't have to be driving to, dispose of waste, and what would that look like? So I'm wondering like how we might be thinking of that if it's just like we're always going to assume that people are going to have to use single occupancy vehicles to, dispose of some of their waste. And then if we, increase convenience for waste disposal, does that hamper kind of long-term goals of reducing waste that goes into our landfills because it's like super convenient and super affordable? So what is the incentive then to think about creative ways of reducing waste that goes to landfill? So those are kind of the questions that I see that are like what we're basing our criteria in the technical analysis on, but I don't know if that meshes well with our stated like long-term goals. So just wanting to make sure we're like asking the right questions before we dive really deeply on these specific data sets.
Well, so there's one thing that we haven't talked about in the no-bill scenario, which is that scenario contemplates, for example, expansion of curbside programs to collect more materials from people for recycling. And then again, going back to the cost question, it is that would be a requirement that Metro could impose on cities and counties to collect more materials through their curbside programs, and Metro would invest basically zero money on that program, but that raises costs to consumers, right? To people with their garbage and recycling monthly bill. In the cost modeling that we've done, you will see the trade-off. That shifts costs to cities and counties to those programs, and there's the materials that we're able to collect curbside is the quantities are small and the costs are relatively high per ton recovered. Even in the DEQ's modeling of the Recycling Modernization Act, some materials were deemed to be better collected at depots because of the environmental impact of collecting them curbside and the cost of collecting them curbside. And one of them is actually glass. So there are trade-offs too. Facilities, depots do serve a purpose. And I think, to me, I would look at the scenarios. And yes, there is garbage in those facilities, in those scenarios, but I would also consider the full range of materials that we are talking about at each of those facilities that we're proposing under all three scenarios.
I just wanted to add too about the organics. So when we say organics collection hub or whatever, that's actually so that it's getting out of the waste stream that's going into the landfill. It's not to collect it and then bring it to the landfill. It's to collect it, separate it, pre-process it, and get it to the right kind of places so it is getting out of the landfill. So that's definitely one of the goals that you mentioned. And then I also just wanted to make sure we're not overlooking when we talk about kind of general public, that's not just your average self-haul person going to a facility. It also includes like the small landscapers and people that they don't have a place on the curb where they're gonna have their waste collected, right? So those sorts of facilities we need to find places where all of the different customers can come. It's not just the big commercial haulers that are, driving their large trucks, but there's a range of customers that aren't necessarily all covered under like a curbside program.
Okay.
I would just say the distributed scenario model is really with the intent of making like like Luis mentioned, as many materials in one place. And so I think that people ultimately, and more accessible and really geared more towards the general public customer rather than the commercial customer. So it could be in the future that people start to think of, combining all these items at the same time. And that is really what we hear is happening in other locales, and hopefully we'll hear more about that next week. But you're right, it's not getting away from the single occupancy car or truck, needing to go to a facility unless we can make some of those distributed, smaller facilities more accessible and somewhat in commercial/industrial, corridors, but.
And yeah, I guess as a consumer, if I understood that I could pay or would pay a bit more but not have to make as many trips, that might be a value proposition that makes sense for a lot of folks. And I don't know if we're engaging like local jurisdictions and community members on that, but I think I'd be interested in just.
Yeah, we have with our community advisory group, they definitely have previewed the scenarios along the way, and definitely like the idea of one stop take back.
Okay, I see Joey has their hand up for, I believe, probably a response. If you have a question, that's another thing. But we have 9 minutes left, and we've got Counselor Gonzalez and Counselor Simpson. I'm going to ask that we actually put a pin in this discussion that we're having, because I think it's good. And I'm going to ask both Counselor Gonzalez and Counselor Simpson to ask your questions. And then our esteemed panel of presenters will respond to both blended, or they will pick the one that they each want to respond to, please. So Counselor Gonzalez first.
Great. Yeah, I mean, I think I'm really appreciative of how this process is unfolding. It's a can that we've been kicking around for a while, and then, we were gaining some momentum, and then COVID really caused us to freeze a lot of these plans, projects, partnerships with external consultants. So happy to see it picking up again. One of the natural tensions that I feel with our hybrid system is, and from what I hear from private providers, is that we're significantly overbuilt in our tonnage capacity, but underbuilt in all these other retail areas. So I mean, one is how do we kind of reconcile the fact that for the last few decades, a lot of our either policy or investment or whatever has led private facilities to do that, and recognizing that's where, most of the revenue that sustains the system is made. Second, I think looking at, what was my question? I'm kind of spacing right now, but it was on the recycling front. I remember a few months ago, years ago, time is relative, I don't know. We had the question of Ridwell and the disruption that Ridwell had created. To my surprise, my local hauler actually created a program very quickly in response to it. And so now I have a purple bin, my Recycle Plus bin, that I can put out whenever. I mean, the system's still a little bit clunky. It's probably not as seamless as an app would be with a pickup and things like that. But I definitely, through that process, have learned to, I don't underestimate the power of a hauler to provide a service, especially if you're going to pay them more. And just kind of the route system in that way. So there's probably certain things that we don't want to put on our curb, and we could probably list them, but we won't do that now. So those are the two things that I'm really thinking about right now. I think in general, the analysis is really helpful, really good, and I think you've set it up well. So not really any questions. There is a question nestled in there, but I'll pass it off to Councilor Simpson.
Simpson?
Thank you. Real quick, how do these scenarios impact like our Rear Patrol team? Because even our own data shows that a lot of our Rear Patrol waste is homeowners. Couches, mattresses, dressers, things like that. And then, you know, other growing, I'm on a +1 Councilor Wong's thought on convenience, because other growing cities, and I, you know, having the experience of growing up in a large city, had bulk pickup. And it was convenient, and it was mainly targeted for like seniors, folks with disabilities, people that don't have transport. And so I really want to like jump in that piece. I know we're like have limited time, but that's where I'm at.
Great, so maybe Joey, you can respond to what you were gonna respond to earlier, and then, one or two responses to wrap up the panel, please.
Yeah, this was just a quick addition to Councilor Huang's discussion about travel emissions and what's coming in the discussion guide and the sub-criteria associated with different travel emissions and greenhouse gas emission reductions. And we did take into consider, and you will be able to compare and contrast what sort of travel emissions and how greenhouse gas emissions are being reduced based off of each scenario versus also like other benefits of greenhouse gas emissions. So.
Great, thank you.
So maybe I can start and then have the project team jump in or build on my response. So starting with Councilor Gonzalez, you mentioned the hybrid system. As we step into this conversation around the scenarios, it highlights the options for Metro's footprint in the system. So you'll be able to see the trade-offs of increased Metro role in the large-scale transfer stations or decreased Metro's role in terms of the no-build or different type of Metro role in the no-build scenario. With Ridwell, has demonstrated that residents are willing to pay more because we are conservationists. We want to recycle. I feel like that's built into the DNA in our region. And again, in the no-build scenario, that talks about what would it look like for Metro to set additional standards for collection requirements at the curb. So that will also be part of the upcoming discussion. To Councilor Simpson's comments around the impact to Rid Patrol, ultimately, one of our goals is to see the amount of garbage that's dumped in our communities to go down. And our levers for doing that are through changes to service. The Bulky Waste Policy Project, which we'll be talking about in November, will give you an update on our work to improve services at both apartments and households, because that's really where we want to tackle it. We want to get to that point where everyone in the region has access to affordable and convenient service for that. The systems plan will look at opportunities for reuse, for how we might manage those materials and get them into a system of reuse to promote them to a higher use. Is there anything that you guys would want to add to that?
Not me. Great job.
I think the one thing that perhaps I could add is the overbuilt in tonnage capacity, but underbuilt in other areas comment, because that is something we briefly looked at. But when people say we're overbuilt in tonnage capacity, it's capacity to build except which types of tons. We do have excess or a lot of capacity to process wet and dry waste in the region. There's many facilities that are happy to take that. So that's where the area to be, I think we need to be kind of specific about overcapacity in which areas, but undercapacity in others, because those facilities, for example, could handle more organics, could handle more yard debris, but many choose not to do so because it doesn't pencil out or because it requires additional modifications to their facilities. So that is one element of what we're trying to solve for in this planning process. And then there's also the question of, we do have capacity, but where is it located? And is it located near where people need it? In the case of the general public, but also for commercial haulers, and at what cost? So I think it was Councilor Gonzalez who mentioned we have a facility that is there very conveniently located, but it charges too much for people to actually understand it as an option for them. So I think that's
a great addition. Yeah. Thank you for that. So there's many different lenses, looking at it from the commercial or the business generators to the household generators to the different materials that all have different requirements and how they're managed.
Great. Well, thank you so much. We're right at 1. I know at least one of us has a 1 o'clock meeting. I believe that many of us do. I'm going to ask Marisa, do you have a short communication?
I'm happy to send my update to you via email.
Perfect. Counselors, anything urgent, or should we save our updates for each other till Thursday? Great. With that, I will adjourn our meeting. We meet again on Thursday, September 26th at 10:30 a.m. Have a good day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Recording stopped.